Thank you all for those wonderful and provocative remarks. I mean, it's and listening to all of it, it sounds like architecture culture is incredibly useful because it manages to concentrate what's completely ridiculous about a broader culture, about all the ways in which a broader culture manages to sort of proliferate binary oppositions and closed loops of information, the way that a broader culture manages to keep banging away with the same blunt tools and ending up with the same kind of violent, deadlocked outcomes. And so to be able to look at our long-suffering behaviors and our tragic endgames, I mean, in a way, if you can outwit architecture culture, then you've really done something that's kind of idiot-proof. So maybe this is like not a bad place to rehearse for all kinds of ventures in the world. I mean, you even see in us, even when we are trying to make radical changes, politically radical changes, we still even enjoy a kind of tragic ultimates and end games and so on, so it's great that we saw some structural ways out of this self-regard in all the discussions today, and they would then necessarily have to be on the flip side of those dominant logics, and if they were, then there could be no manifestos, and that there could be no right answers, or you'd be back in the vortex, the same vortex. So it was interesting that, it seems as if what one could say is that, one's not looking for solutions, but for aggregated problems that leaven and catalyze each other, stay with the trouble. And I think maybe I would also add that, luckily, not our architectural profession, but spatial variables in the world are urgently consequential. So also, luckily, we don't really, even here in the academy, I'm talking about the larger university, we don't really need to become policy experts or lawyers or something, because everybody else in the university is beating us to it, raising the stakes of spatial variables, beginning to teach in ways that are using the word design, in a business school or so on, or a law school. You even see it among the kind of little McKinsey consultant students, CIA agents that I teach in other parts of this university. So I mean, luckily, they are already beginning to see that this is not about the soulful creation of artifacts of self-construction, but more about kind of making different kinds of partnerships across disciplines in different universities and stuff. So, I mean, maybe our students are in some ways getting on with it. And I see in some of the things that are presented today that they are getting on with it, and that you all are getting on with it. Even though I still sometimes see, having worked on this myself here in this school, that still there are these structural problems, some of which you see are those that Peggy's pointed out with architecture lobby and so on. So maybe one other question we might ask is, what are we designing? Are we designing architectural artifacts, but not designing the advent of those artifacts? If you imagine kind of the university hospital model, what if what we were presenting was not architectural ideas to a jury, but talking about the actual entry of these ideas into culture, the way of designing how they enter into, travel into culture, become contagious, leapfrog architectural bureaucracies and planning bureaucracies to go straight to pop culture, which I saw, moments of in what you were talking about. So ways of rehearsing, almost like an improv class in drama school rather than a class in making the sort of masterpiece soliloquy. That's what we do. But the improv class would allow you to be rehearsing your reactivity to making time-released forms, things that can adjust to the moment when they're outmaneuvered by the, political superbugs. But political superbugs on many scales now. Let's get out of, the presidential orange ones, as well as the kind of architectural orange carpet. So I had two questions for you all, which is, now that you are getting on with it, what are the things that are making you most impatient? Like at the top. One other question I had is, what does entrepreneurialism, or if you don't like that word, agency, what does it look like in architecture culture that teaches something to the other startup cliches? In other words, what does our entrepreneurialism look like that doesn't look like, Palo Alto tech startup? What do we have that's different, that gets the attention of the world in a completely different way? And then I also have questions about money somewhere down the line, but maybe those first two are okay for now, and anyone can respond. Fredrik, Nilsson has joined us.
May I start with perhaps at answering those questions, but just saying a few words from my perspective as well. I must say that is it on? Okay. Really enjoyed the fantastic lectures, and I agreed with very much of what you said about the diagnosis and the situation, about the problems and the ways forward. But also I might also see it from a slightly different perspective, coming from a Scandinavian context, and especially a Swedish one, where in Sweden, I would say the architectural profession has had a very weak position for many, many years. So due to, not least I would say, the large constructor companies, like multinational companies like NCC, Skanska, and so on, have pushed the architects to another position that I would say internationally. So we have been very envious looking out internationally and in Europe, and also to our closest neighbors in Denmark and Norway, where the architect and the architecture profession are much more reputed. So when the discussion during, let's say, the last 10 years about the crisis in the profession internationally started, we didn't have that discussion at all in Sweden. We had that crisis longer before. Rather the opposite, a lot of other things started to happen, seeing architects taking new roles, starting to collaborate in new ways, starting up other kinds of practices. For one reason, I think that we, as having that weaker position, were forced to start collaborating in other ways, building networks, trying to advance our position from that way. So in this context, I would say that what's now important for us is rather to try to protect some of those things, a less hierarchical education and this attitude of collaboration, engagement with society, and so on. Because there are tendencies in our country to looking out internationally to go towards what you are actually criticizing. So for me, that's really important to really protect that and build upon that tradition, because there are a lot of interesting things happen there. But what I also see personally as urgent or need in focus, that you have slightly, well, you touched upon it, but not really focused, is the role of research. How that also comes into the picture. How do we develop knowledge? Because there is a huge demand and need for knowledge out there. And there, of course, in academia is not much knowledge available, but it's not made actionable or used. And how, and related to that also, how do we train the researchers in the future? How do we set up collaborations? How do we fund research? And collaborations not only with practices, but with communities, users, and so on. So that would be, for me, interesting to perhaps do the same diagnosis that you did, Jeremy, on research and how that maps together.
Sorry.
Your first one is, what's the intractable problem? Or what's the problem that I see most? I would say... This isn't on, is it? It's on now. Why don't we just agree collectively to abandon the protection of architectural title? Because that seems to me the first thing which sets the domino chain in motion. Because as long as we protect architectural title, whether it's in the States or UK or wherever, and as long as the protection is so diminished as a form of description of what an architect does, then architecture schools, who eventually are aiming towards the thing called an architect, are going to be restricted as well. And I think that discussion, of course, there's so much at stake in this. But we more or less abandon it. We are more or less marginalized. And the interesting thing is that the more marginalized a profession gets, the more hysteric it gets, and therefore the more control it wants to exert through notions of title. And I think that it's an interesting discussion to start to have, and maybe it will happen in the later ones, which is if you abandon protection of title, then architecture education can open up to some of the things that we...
It's not protected in Sweden, actually, the title.
Okay.
I will pick up. Sorry about that. I'll pick up on some of the questions that you asked. The biggest obstacle for us as a startup was bureaucracy, the sheer weight of bureaucracy, and the amount that it changes in the UK is changing rapidly. To be this sort of nimble institution is getting harder and harder in terms of the demands from external agencies that kind of distract your attention, where you constantly have to prove that you're good, even though you'd be much better if you didn't have to constantly prove that you were any good. I think the other question about entrepreneurship, for us, we think it's really important that actually like you were saying about the protection of title, that actually entrepreneurs, thinking about what our key skill set is, sort of spatial intelligence, how we can apply that to lots of different things is super important. And being sort of entrepreneurial, really thinking about where does architecture want to get to on a really long scale. That a lot of the things we're talking about all need addressing and are super important, but where really have we got to get to? Those really urgent challenges that the world has to face, that standing back and be able to ask those questions and using the school as a space to do that isn't just practice, that can ask those big questions, for us has been the most important thing.
One of the reasons why, and your talk is provokes this question too, is that one of the reasons why I asked this question about what is entrepreneurialism that has to do with space? What does that look like? Because you probably see, we see it here at Yale, when there are students who are designing. They're rewiring a city with another kind of spatial relationship. It's not a product. It's not something that VCs, usually get around. So what does our entrepreneurialism look like?
Well, I can think of two examples right away. Joaquin Tobar, who's here in the audience, a recent CCA alum, participated in Jason Kelly Johnson's Creative Architecture Machines studio, in which he challenges students to prototype a way of 3D printing building components or 3D, generating architecture, aiming essentially to help students recognize that architectural agency can encompass generating intellectual property about technical processes as well as designing singular solutions. The second, and that's maybe too close to Palo Alto, to Sand Hill Road for you, but the second one, which is you're also not going to like, I think, is WeWork, where WeWork is essentially deploying the kind of spatial intelligence that we generate with other kinds to create a new service, you know, a new practice category.
I don't say that as a purist. I mean, I've been here working on a seminar for many years about architecture and entrepreneurialism, where we're in it. But I'm just wondering how we exceed that model in a way that gives the world something else. It's not a purist position.
But maybe it's also a question of how we think about it, whether entrepreneurship is the right sort of concept to go with. Because in a sense, we are, of course, not necessarily because we are a God's gift to humanity, but we are still probably the only profession that's trained specifically on many languages, on many levels at the same time. And we are trained to make budgets and steel sheet workers and ontological sort of feeling of being inside the building work together on many levels. So in a sense, I feel that one of the things that we could contribute to society with is the fact that we can actually bring many languages on many different levels into, and maybe also define the context that these sort of discussions take place in. And in ways that maybe, for example, philosophy, sorry if I'm rude, but is maybe failing a little bit. Philosophy is not providing us very much of new tools to take on the world with. But we, as a profession, are trying to, in a sense, moving more into the fields of social studies and philosophy, exactly to do that, to bring things together. And the other question that you would really like to touch a little bit on it, and maybe it's a little naive, but still, I think when it comes to research and when it comes to really getting into our abilities, I think that if we don't give ourselves enough time, to give the students enough time to know who they are, because architecture is such a hugely broad profession in itself. It's almost like a new world in itself, a new set of people. If we don't do that, I mean, how is anyone supposed to know why and what to research? How can you sort of go into it? If the question is not, you were asking before, how can we go about design? The basic question must be, why would we design? And as soon as we know that, we can also know where to go from there and how to contribute, I think.
It's a sort of a paradoxical situation that this culture that we are that we sort of detest on the one hand is nevertheless creating unbelievably correlative thinkers that the world needs so badly. I think that's what you're saying, Jeremy, about sort of letting go of the professional title. But I also like very much your sort of check on that you know, we're not God's gift to the world, so this doesn't come with the heroics. It doesn't come with the same heroics. Because we are running out of time, I think maybe we should open up questions to the audience. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question about age. At what age do you think that young people should specialize their education in architecture? I've, over the years, been asked by countless high school kids, you know, children of my friends, who say, oh, I'm interested in becoming an architect. And invariably, I've always told them, I said, well, don't study architecture as an undergraduate. You know, get a broad liberal arts degree, study philosophy, literature, history, art. It will, you know, make you a better architect in the long run, to be able to communicate with your clients who are going to come from walks of life other than architecture, and to understand the larger world, the larger community that we as architects pretend that we're serving along with our paying clients. Yet I'm also aware that fewer and fewer kids and families can afford a 4-year liberal arts undergraduate degree and then a 3.5-year master's degree. And I'm all in favor of lowering the barriers of entry or perceived barriers of entry into architecture. But so it's a real dilemma. So I'm wondering if you have comments on that.
Well, one thought about that. I think the ideal scenario is to move away from the idea that you need to consume the learning all at once with people only of your same age cohort in a precise window between 18 and 28. And to perhaps recognize that people could front load their learning with the things that let them move first toward the goals of the kind that Will highlighted, and then they're not going to stop learning once they start pivoting toward primarily generating income to pay down the student debt. But so the open, a group at the D School at Stanford a few years ago generated this vision, Stanford 2025, and one pillar was the open loop university, the idea of lifelong learning that can evolve to meet your priorities and needs at different stages. So that might be one approach. Where I don't know that there are a lot of options like that available to students right now.
But your question also presumes that architecture is a specialist discipline, and therefore that, and therefore that the two things are mutually exclusive. Whereas I think that a lot of the conversations are about a kind of synthesis of some of the qualities you're talking about.
Can I add on that? Because I mean, in a sense, why does philosophy and the other why does it have to be outside of architecture? You were talking about you going to high schools to teach. I mean, why not start at 13, 14 with spatial agency or spatial sort of education to be this sort of intermediate? I mean, that also calls for training to be this intermediate element between places. So why not start much sooner, giving people the chance to speak to other disciplines, or if we really want to see them as disciplines, and go from there. I don't know. Yeah.
Hey, thank you all for that. I have a question, I guess, pertaining to the word that's been popping up or being mumbled, discipline, and disciplinarity, and sort of a thing I'm thinking a lot about is how all the positions that you've all represented, what those positions imply on the shaping of students. And I mean shaping in terms of bodies, in terms of subjectivities, in terms of social relations, both within the school and then out into the profession. And I'm wondering if there isn't a call to question not just the methods sort of being used in schools, but also like the actual apparatus of discipline, and sort of how is it possible, do you think, that there are things contained in the apparatus of the discipline that are structural and sort of go down to the very core of how it's done that we have to sort of dismantle and rebuild in a sense? And I think, you know, this could range from, is it entrepreneurialism, or is entrepreneurialism itself filled with these same kind of disciplinary problems that would carry through? So I don't know, it's a question. Can we get out of those structural problems?
Oh, if you're not going to answer, I have a proposition. I have principles. If you don't like them, I have others. No, I think that isn't the reason why we are a separate discipline, why we have this structure, in fact, doesn't it boil down to the fact that we are responsible for, I mean, the security of people? If we sort of really boil down to the essence of us being like a discipline as such. So if we didn't have that, then maybe we had more freedom to sort of maybe be what some people have been calling out for, have other agencies and so on. But as practitioners, we have a huge responsibility, both in terms of budgets and to people. And especially thinking about security, whether that's maybe the sort of central connection between the structure of discipline and, I don't know. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I suppose I have a very short thought on it, that the relationship between what we see as the discipline of architecture and then the profession of architecture, and how separate those two things are, and the kind of autonomous nature sometimes of the discipline, whether how it kind of talks amongst itself sometimes and doesn't connect with other things, and trying to reconcile the sort of competing demands of thinking about what the core knowledge of architecture is, but also then how that's applied to how you might practice this or design it. I think it's something that is something we're trying to work on.
Sorry. I feel privileged to ask the last question. My question is directed to Jonathan. In your talk, you persuasively talked about the need for architectural education to be more expansive, and in particular to include in our curriculums and in our classrooms women, people of color, and people of different gender expressions. And I think another community that is almost entirely overlooked, except when we talk about ADA, is people of different embodiments, people with different cognitive, sensory, and physical, we call them disabilities, for lack of a better word. And so I know at Taubman, you have a program, Initiative for Disability Studies. I believe it's run by Robert Adams, who is a faculty member in architecture. So I was thinking that makes you kind of uniquely positioned to contribute to this field, and I wonder if you could just briefly talk about that program and how its potential to rebuild your program at Taubman.
Yeah, well, just super briefly, I have been really excited to come into a school where the university-wide leadership in disability studies is coming from architecture. That is unusual. And we also have a kind of still nascent Master of Science in Health Design. And I would like to think that between those two, that we could converge those things a little bit. And so questions about the spectrum, the neurological spectrum, or the spectrum of what are our bodies like, and how do they like to be, how do they like to perform and be served? That as we build expertise in health design with public health, kinesiology, Michigan medicine, that the disability studies component can partially integrate with that, while also retaining the distinctive, let's say, philosophical perspective that someone like Donna Haraway brings, that maybe more the humanities will manifest. So that's my hope, that health design and disability studies can together form one of the nuclei for future growth.
Thank you again very much all, and we'll begin again at 2, is that correct?
Two. Thank you. Thank you, Keller.
Thank you.